I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted you've joined us here this evening. Welcome one and all to our little gathering at Gentle Mysteries. It's wonderful how these stories bring us together from every corner of this big, wide world, warming hearts one mystery at a time. Before we begin tonight, I'd love to know in the comments, do you remember the first time you rode a train at dusk, watching the countryside slip quietly past the window? Don't forget to subscribe so our cosy community can keep on growing, and so you never miss a new story. Now, settle in, wrap up in your blanket, and let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The 6:15 departs on time. The last light of an October afternoon was doing its level best to cling to the hills above Chipping Croft, when the 6:15 from Paddington pulled out of the station with its usual, unhurried authority. Steam rose in soft curtains past the platform lamps. A porter trundled an empty barrow back toward the luggage office. A tabby cat, wholly unmoved by the drama of departure, sat washing its ear on a bench at the far end of platform 2. It was, by every observable measure, an entirely ordinary Tuesday evening. Miss Jane Marple, occupying a window seat in the second carriage, first class, at the firm insistence of her nephew Raymond, who had purchased the ticket and could not be argued with, settled her tapestry bag more securely onto her lap and watched the platform slide away behind her. She had been visiting her old friend Dorothea Peel in Paddington for a small operation on Dorothea's hip, and was now returning to St Mary Mead with a pot of Fortnum's lemon curd and a considerable amount of quiet, our private thought. The carriage was not crowded. There were, by Miss Marple's careful count, 7 other passengers, a young woman in a green coat reading a magazine, a retired-looking gentleman with a military moustache and the Financial Times open but unread on his knee, a pale, narrow-faced man in a brown suit who had placed his briefcase on the rack above and immediately closed his eyes, a rather stout woman in widow's black who was eating a sandwich from a paper bag with quiet determination, a clergyman of late middle age who appeared to be asleep, a young man in a brown corduroy jacket who smelled faintly of turpentine, and, in the far corner by the corridor door, a man Miss Marple had noticed immediately because he had not, in the 18 minutes since departure, moved so much as a finger. He was perhaps 60. Well-dressed, or rather once well-dressed, in the manner of a man who had owned good things for a long time and had stopped replacing them. A dark overcoat, a grey woolen scarf tucked with precision around his collar. His hat, a black Homburg, was pulled just slightly forward, which might suggest sleep. His hands, in thin leather gloves, rested on his thighs with a stillness that Miss Marple found, in the way one finds a wrong note in a familiar hymn, quietly, persistently wrong. She knitted 3 rows of the blue bedsock she was making for the St Mary Mead Bazaar. Then she looked up again. He had not moved. Not the small, unconscious movements of sleep. No shift of weight. No slow deepening of the breath visible at the collar. He sat with the perfect, terrible stillness of a man who was not sleeping at all, but had passed beyond the need for sleep entirely. Miss Marple set down her needles. It was at Slough, the first stop where the young woman in the green coat gathered her magazine and departed, that the conductor, a Mr. Gerald Fitch, came through the carriage with a routine inspection of tickets. He reached the still man in the corner, spoke to him twice, touched his arm once, and then stood for a moment with a particular frozen expression on his face, before moving, with careful speed, to the small communication panel at the end of the carriage. By the time the 6:15 pulled into Reading, it was being met by a police constable on the platform, the man in the corner, later identified by the papers in his inside breast pocket as Mr. Oliver Hennessy, solicitor of Hennessy and Farleigh, Market Cross, Chipping Croft, had been dead. The police surgeon would eventually estimate, for somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. Which meant, Miss Marple reflected, folding her knitting neatly into her tapestry bag, that Mr. Oliver Hennessy had died before the train had even left Paddington, or very shortly after. She thought of the blue scarf, the leather gloves, the hat pulled forward just so. She thought of a woman in St Mary Mead, a Mrs. Bantry had known her slightly, who had once propped her late husband in his bath chair on the vicarage lawn for an entire garden party, before anyone noticed he had ceased to participate in the afternoon's activities. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, was really remarkably consistent. Chapter 2. The Compartment Inventory. Detective Inspector Craddock arrived at Reading Station with the particular expression of a man who had been halfway through a very acceptable lamb chop when the telephone rang. He was youngish, sharp-featured, and possessed of the professional briskness that Miss Marple had observed over many years frequently substituted for actual thought. He moved through the carriage with the air of someone performing a task he expected to complete quickly. He did not initially notice Miss Marple at all. This was entirely usual, and she did not mind it in the least. And she sat with her tapestry bag and a half-finished blue bedsock and watched Inspector Craddock move through the carriage with the focused attention she might give to a particularly instructive variety of sweet pea, the kind that looked vigorous at first glance but had, on closer examination, been planted in entirely the wrong soil. The police surgeon, a brisk young man named Dr. Felton, who carried his bag with the self-conscious efficiency of someone recently qualified, crouched beside the body for 4 minutes by Miss Marple's small silver watch, then rose and spoke quietly to Inspector Craddock. Craddock nodded with the expression of a man receiving information that confirmed what he'd already decided. He wrote something in his notebook. Miss Marple, from an angle of perhaps 12 feet, could not read what he wrote. But she could read his posture well enough. Cardiac event, she thought. He has written cardiac event or something very near to it. She returned her gaze to the dead man in the corner and began, in the systematic and unhurried way she might catalogue the contents of a church jumble sale, to take inventory of the compartment. Mr. Oliver Hennessy occupied the far window seat on the corridor side of the carriage, the last seat, pressed into the corner where the exterior wall met the sliding door to the corridor. This was, Miss Marple noted, the seat of a man who either valued privacy or had reason to want his back against something solid. The Homburg hat was still pulled forward. The grey woolen scarf, good quality merino, she thought, with the faintest stripe of darker grey running through it, of the sort sold at 2 or 3 shops in London, and possibly a good department store in Oxford, was wrapped twice around his collar and tucked with a neatness that suggested either personal habit or, and this was the note that hummed unpleasantly in the back of her mind, the hands of someone else. She had known a sexton in St. Mary Mead, a Mr. Gorringe, who had wrapped his scarves with exactly that precision. He'd been a bachelor of rigid habit who could not abide a loose end. When his niece had borrowed one of his scarves and returned it folded differently, he had not spoken to her for 11 days. The point being, men of Mr. Hennessy's apparent type, a solicitor, 60, long established, a man of routine, wore their scarves in a specific personal way. The scarf around his collar had been wrapped from the left. Miss Marple, observing the faint compression of the merino at his right shoulder, formed the quiet opinion that Mr. Hennessy had habitually wrapped his own scarf from the right. Small thing, possibly nothing. She filed it carefully and moved on. His briefcase, dark brown leather, the old-fashioned kind with brass clasps and reinforced corners, the kind that lasted 40 years if you looked after them, was not on the rack above his head. It was on the floor, between his feet, fallen or placed at a slight angle so that the left clasp rested against his right shoe. The clasps were both closed and locked. His left hand, resting on his thigh, had a faint reddish mark at the base of the thumb, a pressure mark, the kind left by a leather handle gripped for some time with considerable force. So he had been holding the briefcase, and then he had not been. His coat pockets, as far as could be observed without touching him, held nothing visible at the left. At the right, there was a slight outward pull to the fabric, something heavier than a handkerchief, but the pocket itself was flush and closed. The papers identifying him had been in his inside breast pocket, which the police surgeon had opened. These had been replaced with the slightly crumpled look of things handled quickly by someone wearing rubber gloves. On the small fold-down tray attached to the seat back in front of him, the kind that swung down for tea or newspapers, there was a single white cup from the dining car. British Railways, the standard white with the small crest. It was empty. There was no saucer. Across the rim, and at approximately the 7 o'clock position if one imagined the cup faces a clock, a faint brownish residue, not tea-coloured but slightly darker, and with a quality of having dried unevenly, as though the liquid had been thick. Miss Marple thought of Dr. Haydock, who had once told her, in the course of a conversation about a very different matter, that digitalis in sufficient concentration had a faint bitter quality that a strong sweet beverage could adequately mask. She thought of the cup. She thought of the fold-down tray, which required 2 hands to open smoothly, and which was therefore unlikely to have been opened by a man already feeling the first creeping numbness of a failing heart. Someone had opened that tray, someone had placed that cup. She looked then at the floor beneath the seat, at the gap between Mr. Hennessy's left shoe and the base of the carriage wall. There was a very small scattering of white powder, no larger than a sixpence in total area, of the kind that might have been a spilled aspirin or a crushed tablet of some sort. The train's movement would, by now, have shifted it slightly. It had originally been, she estimated, directly beneath the fold-down tray. She became aware that Inspector Craddock was addressing the carriage at large. "If anyone observed anything of note during the journey," he said, in the tone of a man who expected the answer to be no, "I'd be grateful if you'd make yourself known." There was the expected shuffling silence. The retired gentleman folded his Financial Times. The young man in corduroy stared at the floor. The widow in black had stopped eating her sandwich and sat with it held in both hands as though unsure what to do with it now. Miss Marple raised one small gloved hand. Inspector Craddock looked at her for the first time with the expression she recognised. The brief assessment, the quick conclusion, elderly, travelling alone, probably nervous, and the professional patience one arranged over one's face before dealing with elderly ladies on trains. "Yes, madam." "I wonder," said Miss Marple in her most apologetically gentle voice, "whether anyone has thought to look at the cup on the tray. And also, I do hope you'll forgive me, Inspector, it is probably nothing at all. Whether someone might check which direction Mr. Hennessy's scarf has been wrapped. Only," she added, folding her hands over her knitting with the air of someone raising the most trifling domestic observation, "it does seem to have been wrapped from the wrong side." Inspector Craddock wrote something else in his notebook. His expression suggested he had written something polite. Miss Marple looked back at the compartment, at the cup, at the briefcase between the dead man's feet, at the powder on the floor. She thought of a woman she had once known in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Clitheroe, who had been a dispenser's assistant before her marriage, and had retained, as people always do, the habits of her professional life. There was a particular way such a woman would measure, a particular care she would take with a cup. The train sat in the reading station lights, patient and still. Outside, the October dark pressed against the window glass. Someone, Miss Marple thought, had planned this at Paddington and had left at Slough. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Left at Slough. The station at Slough had, in Miss Marple's considered opinion, always possessed the particular anonymity of a place designed for passing through rather than arriving at. She had changed trains there once, many years ago, accompanying her sister to a dental appointment in Windsor, and had retained the impression of a great deal of grey concrete and pigeons with an inflated sense of their own importance. It was, she reflected, precisely the sort of station one chose if one wished to disappear without the inconvenience of actually going anywhere. Inspector Craddock, to his modest credit, had thought to send a constable to telephone the Slough station master before the reading platform had fully cleared. The result of this initiative arrived back at the carriage in the form of a message relayed through the guard. The 6:15 had discharged 11 passengers at Slough. Of these, 7 had been met by persons on the platform: husbands, a taxi driver with a card, a school porter collecting 2 boys, and their departures were, for practical purposes, accounted for. 4 had not been met. Of these 4, one was an elderly man with a walking stick who had been observed by the platform attendant struggling with a large suitcase, and who had taken the station taxi toward the town centre. One was a boy of perhaps 16 with a school cap and a cricket bag. One was a commercial traveller of the rotund, cheerful variety, who had paused to buy an evening paper from the platform kiosk and had then walked toward the car park. The 4th was a woman in a green coat. Miss Marple had noticed her, of course. One noticed green coats, particularly the specific green of this one, not the bright, assertive green of someone making a statement, but the muted, expensive green of someone who had chosen the colour thoughtfully and some years ago, and had maintained it with care. A wool and cashmere blend, she had thought at the time. The kind of coat that aged well because it had been bought to age well. The kind of coat that spoke not of fashion, but of standards. She had been reading a magazine, Homes and Gardens, Miss Marple had noted, though not with the inattentive flicking of someone genuinely reading. The pages had turned at intervals of approximately 4 minutes, which was either the reading speed of a woman absorbing very little, or the performance of a woman maintaining an appearance of absorption. She had not looked at Mr. Hennessy once, not even the single, idle glance that any passenger might cast across a carriage out of simple human curiosity. In Miss Marple's experience, People who did not look at other people in train carriages were either lost in genuine preoccupation or were exercising a very deliberate and practiced discipline of avoidance. The woman in the green coat had sat with her magazine and her careful 4-minute page turns in her eyes that never once drifted to the corner seat, and she had gathered her things at Slough with the unhurried composure of someone who had known, from the moment she boarded, exactly when she would be leaving. She had left behind, on the seat she had occupied, nothing. No dropped glove, no forgotten ticket, or no trace of her presence. The seat itself, when the constable examined it at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, yielded only the faint impression in the upholstery of a person of medium build and composed posture. But beneath the seat, half concealed against the metal footrail, there was a single folded square of paper, the size of a cigarette card, which the constable nearly overlooked entirely, and which Miss Marple pointed to with the tip of her umbrella before he could pass it by. Inspector Craddock unfolded it with a pencil, declining to touch the surface. It was on examination a small section torn from a printed page, not a magazine page, but something of heavier stock, like a solicitor's letterhead or a formal notice. The printing visible on the fragment read only Farleigh, Market Cross, Chip, Hennessy and Farleigh, Market Cross, Chipping-Croft, the dead man's own firm. It could have been there some time, Inspector Craddock said, with the tone of a man who very much wished something to be the case. Dropped by a previous passenger. The cleaning between runs isn't always thorough. No, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. It isn't, is it? Though I notice that particular fragment has no dust on it whatsoever, and there is quite a respectable quantity of dust on the footrail itself, which suggests it was placed there recently. But you are quite right to consider all possibilities, Inspector. Craddock looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. It was not a comfortable expression for him, and she was sorry for that, in the way one is sorry for a cat that has misjudged the width of a gap. She thought it best to offer him something more concrete. The young woman boarded at Paddington, she said. I noticed her on the platform before departure. She was standing near the confectionery kiosk not purchasing anything for approximately 6 minutes. The train was due to leave at 6:15. She boarded at 6:12, which suggests she was not uncertain about her carriage allocation. She knew where she intended to sit. Craddock's pencil had begun moving again. You have a good memory, miss. Marple, Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead. She paused. I also recall that she was carrying, in addition to the magazine, a small brown paper bag of the sort used by the railway tea trolley. She had, I believe, purchased 2 cups of tea at the platform trolley before boarding. She was carrying both cups. The inspector looked up. She was carrying 2 cups, he repeated. She was, said Miss Marple. Though by the time she took her seat, she appeared to have only one. She let that observation rest for a moment, as one lets a stitch settle before drawing the thread through. I thought at the time that perhaps she'd spilled one, or set it down. These platform cups are not ideally designed for carrying in quantity. But then I noticed the cup on Mr. Hennessy's fold-down tray, and it occurred to me that the dining car trolley does not, as a rule, come through until after the first stop. So the question of where that cup originated becomes rather interesting, don't you think? There was a silence in the carriage that had a different quality than the silence before. Even the young man in corduroy had stopped looking at the floor. The tray, Craddock said, his voice carrying a new, careful register. Yes, said Miss Marple. And the powder beneath it, which I do hope someone has photographed in situ before the train moved any further and redistributed it. She looked at him with the mild, faintly anxious expression she had cultivated over many decades as a highly effective shield. I'm sure you had already thought of all this, Inspector. I only mention it because at my age one does tend to fuss over small details. Craddock had in fact not photographed the powder. He moved now to remedy this with an energy that suggested the lamb chop had been entirely forgotten. Miss Marple turned back to the dark window. She was thinking about the fragment of letterhead, about Hennessy and Farleigh, Market Cross, Chipping-Croft, about a woman who had stood at a platform kiosk for 6 minutes without buying anything, and who had known precisely which carriage to board, and who had left at Slough with the quiet efficiency of someone completing a task they had rehearsed thoroughly. She was also thinking about a girl she had known in St. Mary Mead, a solicitor's clerk named Edith Polwarth, sharp as good scissors and twice as precise, who had once told her that the most dangerous person in any legal office was never the solicitor himself, but the person who understood exactly what the solicitor's files contained and what those files were worth. She thought of the locked briefcase between the dead man's feet. She thought of the missing second cup. The woman in the green coat, Miss Marple thought, did not act alone. One rarely does, in matters of this complexity. There is always someone who benefits, and someone who telephones. The lights of the reading platform slid slowly backward as the 6:15, thus cleared now to continue its journey, pulled out into the autumn dark toward Chipping Croft. In the corner, Mr. Oliver Hennessy rode on in his perfect, terrible stillness, and said nothing at all. Chapter 4. The Firm of Hennessy and Farleigh Market Cross. Chipping Croft was the kind of small English square that appeared, at first glance, to have been arranged by someone with a very firm idea of what an English small square ought to look like. There was a war memorial with fresh chrysanthemums at its base. There was a chemist, a post office, a tea room with net curtains, and a tobacconist whose window display had not materially changed since 1947. There was a church with a yew tree so old it had stopped being remarkable and become simply a feature of the landscape, like the hills behind it, or the particular grey of the October sky. And there, at the corner where Market Cross met the narrow descent of Farrow Lane, was the office of Hennessy and Farleigh, solicitors, established, according to the painted board above the door, in 1903. The door was black. The brass plate was polished to a degree that suggested either professional pride or someone with a great deal of nervous energy and a chamois cloth. The windows were clean. The whole establishment had the composed, uninformative expression of an institution that had been keeping other people's secrets for a very long time and intended to continue doing so. Miss Marple arrived at 10:20 the following morning, having spent the night at the Railway Hotel on Station Road, a modest but perfectly adequate establishment where the porridge was hot, and the proprietress, a Mrs. Double, had the usefully gossipy quality of a woman who considered herself a fair judge of character, and was eager to demonstrate this to any sympathetic listener. Mrs. Double had been, over breakfast, extremely informative. The firm of Hennessy and Farleigh, it emerged, was in the process of what Mrs. Double described with considerable relish as a situation. Mr. Oliver Hennessy, the senior partner, the one who had died on the train, though Mrs. Double had not yet heard this news and Miss Marple had not supplied it, had been, by all available local opinion, a perfectly decent man of the old school. Methodical, reliable, not given to excess in any direction. A widower these past 9 years. No children. Member of the parish council and the Rotary and the committee of the local horticultural society, though not, Mrs. Double noted with a slight pursing of the lips, a regular church-goer. Mr. Farleigh, the junior partner, Geoffrey Farleigh, who had joined the firm 14 years ago as a clerk and worked his way upward with the patient determination of a man who knew exactly where he was going, was another matter entirely. Very charming, Mrs. Double had said, refilling Miss Marple's tea with the emphasis of someone for whom charming was not a compliment. Very well presented. Wife's a pretty thing. Eleanor, they call her, though she was a Brentwood before she married. The Brentwoods from over Malton Way. They have the daughter, of course, 12 years old, very quiet child. A pause. People say he works very hard. I'm sure that's true. People say a lot of things that are true about Geoffrey Farleigh. Miss Marple had understood from 40 years of similar conversations that what Mrs. Double was not saying was considerably more interesting than what she was. And the partnership itself, she had asked, in the tone of someone making idle conversation over marmalade. I imagine a firm of that age has a great deal of history. Mrs. Double had set down the teapot with the deliberateness of someone arriving at the point they had been steering toward all along. There's talk, she said, of a client account, a large one, a Miss Arabella Trent. She was a patient at the Elmwood nursing home, poor soul, no family to speak of. Died in August. Left everything, they say, to a charitable foundation that Mr. Hennessy administered, a considerable sum. She had looked at Miss Marple with the frank assessing gaze of a woman who has delivered the important line and wants to confirm it has landed. They say Mr. Farleigh felt the administration of that fund ought to have been shared, or they say he raised it with Mr. Hennessy formally, last month, in writing. In writing, Miss Marple had thought. How very interesting, and how very dangerous. The young woman who admitted her to Hennessy and Farleigh at 10:20 was not the woman in the green coat. She was 19, perhaps 20, with ink on her right forefinger and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had received difficult news very recently and had not yet decided what expression to replace it with. Her name, as offered with automatic professional reflex, was Miss Cartwright. She was, unmistakably, a girl in the first hours of grief. Not the dramatic, collapsing kind, but the quiet, stunned kind that sits very still and continues answering the telephone because it does not yet know what else to do. So the news had reached the office, though within the last hour, Miss Marple estimated, observing the single bald handkerchief half concealed beneath the desk blotter and the telephone receiver that had been replaced with slightly too much care. "I wonder," said Miss Marple with great gentleness, "whether Mr. Farleigh might be available for a brief word. I was a client of Mr. Hennessy's in a small matter. I was passing through and had hoped to speak with him." She paused. "I've heard the news, my dear. I'm very sorry. He was a good man." Miss Cartwright's composure buckled very slightly and then held. "I'll see if Mr. Farleigh is— Yes, if you'll wait." She disappeared through an inner door. Miss Marple waited. She looked at the reception room with the quiet thoroughness she brought to all rooms. It was a solicitor's waiting room of the traditional variety. 2 upright chairs, a low table with a 3-week-old copy of Country Life, a filing cabinet of dark green metal with a small scratch near the lower handle. On the wall, a framed print of the Market Cross as it had looked in approximately 1920. On the desk, in addition to the telephone and the concealed handkerchief, a shallow wooden tray of incoming correspondence. The top letter in the tray was sealed. It had been opened, the flap had been lifted, and then pressed closed again imperfectly, so that one corner of the flap stood slightly proud of the envelope. The postmark read the previous Monday. The return address, printed in the upper left corner, read, Elmwood Nursing Home, Chipping Croft. Miss Marple looked at this for a moment with great attention. Then she looked away, as one looks away from something one intends to think about carefully and privately before discussing with anyone. The inner door opened and Geoffrey Farleigh came out. He was perhaps 45, well built in the softening way of a man who had once been athletic and had since become sedentary, with a broad, pleasant face and the kind of steady, frank gaze that Miss Marple had observed over many years could be either entirely genuine or the most polished of all possible performances. His suit was excellent. His tie was correctly sombre, navy, not black, suggesting either that he had not yet felt the news warranted full mourning, or that he had dressed this morning before the telephone had rung. Miss Marple. He extended his hand with the warmth of a man entirely accustomed to making strangers feel they were known to him. "I'm afraid this is a very difficult morning for the firm. I trust Miss Cartwright explained—" "She did," said Miss Marple, "and I would not dream of imposing on such a morning, Mr. Farleigh. I only wish to ask one very small thing." She met his steady gaze with her own, which was considerably steadier than it appeared. "I believe Mr. Hennessy may have been carrying certain documents relating to the Arabella Trent estate when he travelled yesterday. His briefcase—" She watched his face with the concentrated attention she gave to particularly instructive varieties of rose. "Will of course be examined by the police. I imagine you'll want to ensure the relevant files are all accounted for." There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Geoffrey Farleigh's pleasant face did something very small and very quick. A fractional stillness around the eyes, a microscopic tightening at the corner of the mouth, that was gone before it had fully arrived. "Of course," he said smoothly, "I shall make sure the office is fully cooperative with the police, as we always are." Miss Marple thanked him, declined tea and left. On the pavement outside, she stood for a moment in the October air and thought about that 2-second pause, about the Elmwood Nursing Home letter with its imperfectly resealed flap, about Miss Cartwright's ink-stained finger and her concealed handkerchief, about a woman who had stood at a Paddington platform kiosk for 6 minutes without buying anything, and who wore a coat of muted, expensive green. She thought that it was time to visit Elmwood Nursing Home. She also thought, and this was the thought that settled most quietly and most firmly into place, that Geoffrey Farleigh had not asked her how she knew about the Arabella Trent estate. He had not asked because he already knew who she was, and that, Miss Marple reflected, adjusting her gloves and turning toward the hill that led to Elmwood, was really the most interesting thing of all. Chapter 5. The Elmwood Nursing Home. Elmwood Nursing Home sat at the top of a long gradual hill on the eastern edge of Chipping Croft, behind a low stone wall and a row of copper beech trees that had turned, in the October cold, to the colour of old pennies. It was a converted Victorian house of the better sort. Wide bay windows, a gravel drive kept fastidiously raked, a conservatory added at some point in the 1930s, that had been done well enough to almost look original. There were no visible patients in the garden, which was expected at this hour and this temperature, but the curtains in the upper windows were drawn back with the regularity of an institution that maintained its schedules as a point of moral principle. It was, on the surface, a perfectly respectable establishment. Miss Marple, walking up the gravel drive with a slightly effortful gait she had found useful on occasions when appearing less formidable than one was, thought of 3 other respectable establishments she had known over the years. A respectable boarding house in Torquay, a respectable school in the home counties, a respectable nursing home not unlike this one, in a village 7 miles from St Mary Mead, where a perfectly respectable matron had been systematically amending the wills of 7 patients over a period of 4 years before a district nurse with sharp eyes and sharper instincts had noticed that the grateful bequests all shared the same handwriting. Human nature, as Miss Marple had observed on many such occasions, was consistent. Respectability was its favourite disguise. The matron of Elmwood was a Mrs. Vera Stanhope, a tall woman of approximately 55, with the upright posture of a former ward sister, and the composed authority of someone who had long since stopped finding difficult situations surprising. She had iron grey hair pinned with precision, a navy uniform of impeccable cleanliness, and the measured warmth of a woman who had learned, professionally, the exact quantity of warmth appropriate to any given encounter and dispensed it accordingly. She received Miss Marple in her office, a small well-ordered room off the main entrance hall, with a desk clear of everything except a single manila folder, a pen, and a small framed photograph turned at an angle that made its subject visible to Mrs. Stanhope but not to visitors. Miss Marple noted the angle and filed it for later consideration. Miss Marple, Mrs., and Stanhope did not ask how she could help, which was itself a form of information. I understand you were acquainted with Mr. Hennessy. In a professional capacity, Miss Marple said, settling into the visitor's chair with the air of someone prepared to take her time. A small matter of a family trust. Nothing that need concern the nursing home directly. She paused. I have heard, of course, about the very sad news this morning. Mr. Hennessy was a thorough and conscientious man. I imagine his passing creates certain administrative complications for the home. Mrs. Stanhope's expression was a masterwork of professional neutrality. We're confident the firm will ensure continuity. I'm sure Mr. Farleigh will manage admirably, Miss Marple agreed. She watched Mrs. Stanhope's face with great attention as she said this. There was no visible reaction, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, itself a reaction. The particular stillness of a woman who had prepared herself for the name to be mentioned. I believe Miss Arabella Trent was a resident here for some time. Miss Trent was with us for 4 years, Mrs. Stanhope said. She passed in August, a gentle soul. We were very fond of her. 4 years is a considerable time, Miss Marple said warmly. One becomes, I imagine, almost like family, particularly when a resident has no family of their own to speak of. Another pause, light as the settling of a leaf. I believe her estate was a substantial one. The quality of Mrs. Stanhope's silence shifted by a degree that most people would not have detected. Miss Marple detected it with the precision of a woman who had been listening to silences for 80 years. Miss Trent was a woman of some means, she said. The administration of her estate is a matter for the solicitors. Of course, said Miss Marple, and for the charitable foundation, naturally, the one Mr. Hennessy administered. I believe it was established some years ago for the benefit of— I'm sorry, I don't recall the specific beneficiary. My memory for these formal names is not what it was. The Trent Educational Foundation, Mrs. Stanhope said, and then appeared to decide that she had said this slightly too promptly, and amended her expression to one of careful neutrality. How very admirable, said Miss Marple. Education is such a worthy cause. She looked around the room with the apparently idle curiosity of an elderly visitor with time on her hands. Her eyes passed over the desk, the filing cabinet, the framed certificates on the wall. State Registered Nurse, 1952, Ward Sister Commendation, 1961, and came to rest, briefly, on the small framed photograph at its precise angle. It showed, from what she could discern, a young woman of perhaps 30 in a garden. The garden had a distinctive iron gate of the ornamental variety, painted black, with a pattern of interlocking circles at its upper rail. Miss Marple stored this detail with the care she gave to all small, specific, potentially significant things. I wonder, I hope you'll forgive a rather direct question, Mrs. Stanhope. whether Miss Trent was of entirely sound mind in her final months. I only ask because in matters of estate administration, questions of capacity do sometimes arise, and I would not wish the Foundation's work to be disrupted by any unnecessary complications. There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to be interesting. Miss Trent's capacity was never in question, Mrs. Stanhope said. Dr. Fellows assessed her regularly. His notes are thorough and entirely clear. Dr. Fellows, Miss Marple repeated, with the tone of someone committing a name to memory for the most innocent of reasons. The local practitioner? The home's medical consultant. He has attended our residence for 11 years. A slight emphasis on 11 years that carried, beneath its professional surface, a warning of the most polite and implacable kind. Miss Marple thanked her warmly, expressed the hope that the home would not be too greatly inconvenienced by the day's sad news, and rose to leave. At the door she paused, the pause that she'd found over many decades to be the most productive moment in any conversation, arriving as it did when the other person had already begun to relax. "One small thing," she said, turning with an apologetic smile. "The letter your home sent to Mr. Hennessy's office. I believe it arrived on Monday. I only mention it because I noticed it in the incoming tray this morning, and given the circumstances, I do think Inspector Craddock will want to see it. I imagine it concerns the Foundation's accounts, does it?" Mrs. Stanhope's composed face did something very small and very final, a settling, or like ice forming over still water. "It was a routine quarterly statement," she said. "I'm sure it was," said Miss Marple pleasantly. She walked back down the gravel drive with the copper beeches moving gently overhead, and thought about routine quarterly statements that were sealed and then opened and then imperfectly resealed. She thought about Dr. Fellows, who had attended Elmwood for 11 years and whose name had been offered as a defence. She thought about the iron gate in the photograph on Mrs. Stanhope's desk, the one with the interlocking circles, and whether she had seen that particular pattern anywhere in Chipping Croft during the course of the morning. She had, at the entrance to a private residence on Farrow Lane, the lane that ran directly beside the offices of Hennessy and Farleigh. And Miss Marple stood at the bottom of the hill, her tapestry bag over one arm and the October wind moving through her coat, and reflected that the threads were becoming considerably less separate than they had appeared on the train last night. There was a connection between Elmwood Nursing Home and the offices of Hennessy and Farleigh that was not merely professional. There was a gate with interlocking circles on Farrow Lane. There was a letter that someone had opened and resealed. There was a charitable foundation worth, she estimated, from the figures Mrs. Double had implied over breakfast, somewhere in the region of £100,000, administered solely by a man who was now dead. And there was Mrs. Stanhope, who had known the name of the foundation without pausing to recall it, and who had offered the word 11 years as though it were a wall. Miss Marple turned toward the town centre, where she intended to visit the local library, examine the electoral register for Farrow Lane, and then take a cup of tea at the tea room on Market Cross. She thought that the tea room would also be useful. Tea rooms in small towns were, in her experience, the most reliable repositories of local knowledge in existence, far superior to newspaper archives and only marginally less informative than the post office. She wanted to know whose house stood behind the gate with the interlocking circles. She already had a very strong suspicion. But suspicion, as Miss Marple had always maintained, was merely the beginning of the work. The work itself required evidence, and evidence, in her experience, had a way of appearing to the patient and observant in the most domestic and apparently unremarkable of places. One simply had to know where to look. Chapter 6. The Gate on Farrow Lane. The tea room on Market Cross was called, with the gentle unoriginality common to such establishments, the Copper Kettle. It had net curtains, a bell above the door that announced arrivals with cheerful indiscretion, and the particular warm smell, toasted tea cake, furniture polish, a background note of something cinnamon, that Miss Marple associated with the kind of place where nothing of any apparent consequence was discussed, and everything of actual consequence was known. She took the small table by the window, ordered tea and a buttered scone, and settled in with the patient, receptive quality of a woman with nowhere particular to be. The proprietress, a Mrs. Ida Hatch, according to the small frame certificate of business registration visible behind the counter, was a compact, energetic woman of 60 with the bright cataloguing eyes of someone who had spent decades observing the inhabitants of a small town and had developed strong opinions about all of them. She brought the tea with the efficiency of long habit and the conversational instinct of someone who recognised in Miss Marple a sympathetic and appreciative audience. "Terrible news this morning," she said, setting down the scone with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. "Mr. Hennessy, on the evening train they're saying. His heart apparently, though my sister's husband's cousin is a constable at Reading, and he says," she paused for effect, "that it wasn't so straightforward as all that." "How very distressing," said Miss Marple, with exactly the right degree of concerned interest. "He was well known in the town, I imagine." 40 years, said Mrs. Hatch, with the reverence one reserves for institutions. "Longer than the war memorials had that crack in the base. He did my mother's conveyancing in 1954. Did half the town's wills, one way or another." She lowered her voice to the register used for significant information. "Did Miss Trent's will, of course. The Elmwood lady. Left everything to that foundation of his. £120,000, they say, though nobody's meant to know that." "Goodness," said Miss Marple. "And there are those who felt—" Mrs. Hatch arranged her cloth with the deliberateness of someone choosing their words, "that certain people were more interested in that foundation than Mr. Hennessy entirely knew." Miss Marple drank her tea and listened. And by the time she'd finished her scone, she had learned 3 things of material significance. The first was that Dr. Fellows, the Elmwood medical consultant of 11 years, lived on Farrow Lane, in the house behind the gate with the interlocking circles. He was a bachelor of 50, described by Mrs. Hatch as very private, which in Miss Marple's experience was a description applied equally to the genuinely reserved and to those with reasons for privacy that did not bear examination. The second was that Eleanor Farleigh, Geoffrey Farleigh's wife, the former Eleanor Brentwood from over Moulton Way, had been before her marriage a nursing administrator at Elmwood. For 3 years before she left to marry Mr. Farleigh, she had worked directly under Mrs. Vera Stanhope. The third was that the woman in the green coat, when described in careful and general terms as a visitor Miss Marple had met on the train, was identified by Mrs. Hatch without perceptible hesitation as almost certainly Miss Diana Felton, Mr. Farleigh's personal secretary. Quiet girl, very efficient, had a flat above the newsagent on Station Road and had worked for the firm for 6 years. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Hatch, left a generous tip, and walked the short distance to Farrow Lane. Farrow Lane was narrow and old, running between a high stone wall on one side and a terrace of Georgian cottages on the other, before widening slightly at its lower end where it met Market Cross. The offices of Hennessy and Farleigh occupied the corner building. 3 doors further up the lane, set back behind a small front garden of clipped box hedges and late-season roses, was a house of moderate size and excellent maintenance, fronted by an iron gate with interlocking circles at its upper rail. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a moment with the unremarkable air of a woman consulting her sense of direction. The house was quiet. The curtains on the ground floor were half-drawn. Not the half-drawn curtains of someone who wanted privacy from the lane, but the specific half-drawn quality of curtains in a room that was not currently in use, but was expected to be used later. A milk bottle on the step had been taken in. The Morning Post had been collected. The letterbox flap was closed, but had the faint, outward displacement of having been recently used. Someone was at home, someone who was being very quiet about it. On the gatepost, almost invisible against the grey stone, there was a small dark smear at approximately shoulder height, the kind left by a coat sleeve brushing against a rough surface in passing. The coat, from the colour and texture of the residue, had been of a dark material, possibly navy, possibly black. Beside it, caught on the iron curl of the gate's upper hinge, was a single thread. Approximately 3 centimetres long, fine, of a grey colour that Miss Marple identified without any particular difficulty as merino wool of the better quality. The same grey as the scarf wrapped around the neck of Mr. Oliver Hennessy on the 6:15 from Paddington. She looked at the thread for a long time without touching it. Then she walked to the end of the lane, turned onto Market Cross, and went directly to the telephone box outside the post office. Inspector Craddock arrived 22 minutes later in a police Wolseley with a constable who had a notebook and the eager expression of someone hoping for more action than the morning had so far provided. Miss Marple met them at the corner of Farrow Lane and explained, in the precise, apologetically understated way she had refined to a considerable art, what she had observed on the gate post and the gate hinge, and why she believed the thread merited careful collection an examination before the October wind made the decision for them. Craddock looked at the thread with the expression of a man making a series of rapid internal adjustments. He had, over the course of the past 14 hours, been making rather a lot of these. "You're saying Hennessy was here," he said, "on Farrow Lane." "Before the train." "I'm saying his scarf may have been here," Miss Marple said with precise accuracy. "Or a garment of very similar composition. Dr. Fellows lives in this house, Inspector. Mr. Hennessy's train departed Paddington at 6:15. If Mr. Hennessy came to Chippingcroft by the earlier train, the 3:40 from Paddington arrives here at 5:02, he would have had approximately an hour before needing to be at the station for the return journey." Craddock was quiet for a moment. "Why would he come down and go straight back?" "That," said Miss Marple, "is the question I have been considering since breakfast." She looked at the gate with its interlocking circles. "I think Mr. Hennessy came to Chippingcroft yesterday afternoon because he had learned something about the Trent Foundation accounts that he needed to confront directly, and that he did not wish to do so by letter or by telephone. He was that kind of man. Careful, traditional, face to face. He would have wanted to see the person he was confronting and to observe their reaction." "Fellows," Craddock said. "Or someone he met here," Miss Marple said. "Or someone who followed him here, which is a slightly different matter and rather more concerning." Craddock had the constable photograph the thread and the smear before touching either. Then he turned to Miss Marple with the expression of a man arriving at a question he should have asked some time ago. "Miss Marple, who exactly told you about the Trent Foundation? You mentioned it to Farleigh this morning. You mentioned it to me last night. You arrived on that train as a civilian passenger from London." "I arrived," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "as a civilian passenger from London who had been visiting a friend with a hip complaint. But I have also been corresponding for the past 3 weeks with Mr. Hennessy." Craddock stared. "He wrote to me," she said simply, "through a mutual acquaintance, Dr. Haydock of St. Mary Mead, who knew his predecessor. He had become concerned about certain irregularities in the Foundation's quarterly accounts, small irregularities, the sort that are easy to overlook individually and rather alarming when viewed consecutively." She opened her tapestry bag and produced, with the matter-of-fact air of someone locating a shopping list, 3 folded letters. "He asked for a second opinion, I suppose one might say, from someone outside the professional circle, someone unlikely to be known to the parties involved." She held the letters out to Craddock. "I was, of course, coming to Chippingcroft regardless," she said. "I had arranged a visit on Wednesday. Mr. Hennessy was to meet me at the station." A small pause. He did not know, I think, quite how far matters had already progressed. People rarely do, when they are very close to a situation. They see the individual threads. It takes a certain distance to see that the threads have already been woven into a pattern. Craddock took the letters with the careful hands of a man receiving objects that have abruptly altered the shape of his morning. "The pattern," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Farleigh and Fellows and Mrs. Stanhope, and the Foundation accounts, and a secretary who bought 2 cups of tea at Paddington and left at Slough, and a letter resealed imperfectly, and a scarf wrapped from the wrong side." She looked at the gate with the interlocking circles and at the quiet house behind it. "And a man who came to Chippingcroft yesterday afternoon to confront someone, and who did not leave Chippingcroft alive, though he left on the 6:15 in a manner of speaking." She adjusted her gloves. "I think," she said, "that it would be very useful to speak with Dr. Fellows, before he has had time to speak with Mr. Farleigh." Chapter 7. Dr. Fellows receives a visitor. Dr. Malcolm Fellows opened his front door at 11:43 in the morning with the expression of a man who had been expecting a knock and had spent the intervening time deciding how to receive it. He was 50, as Mrs. Hatch had indicated, with the careful physical maintenance of someone who understood the appearance of health as a professional asset. Good colour, trim build, a dark wool cardigan of the expensive, understated variety worn over a collared shirt. His hair was silver at the temples in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. His hands, Miss Marple noted as he gripped the doorframe with his left, were entirely steady. A lesser observer might have found this reassuring. Miss Marple found it interesting. Steady hands in a moment of surprise. Genuine surprise. The involuntary kind, the kind that arrived before the conscious mind could organise a response, were the hands of a man whose composure was not a reaction to circumstance but a permanent condition. The kind of composure that was not learned in a crisis but maintained through all circumstances as a matter of essential architecture. She had known 2 other people with hands like that in her life. One had been a very fine surgeon, the other had been a poisoner. "Dr. Fellows," said Inspector Craddock with official brevity, "I wonder if we might come in." The sitting room of Dr. Fellows' house was a room that told a coherent and deliberate story about its occupant. Books, medical texts predominantly, with a shelf of history and one of natural science, arranged with the precision of someone who returned things to their exact position. A desk in the alcove beside the fireplace, cleared of papers with a thoroughness suggesting recent clearing rather than habitual tidiness. A fire laid but not lit, the kindling arranged with the same geometric care as the books. 2 chairs and a sofa, all of good quality, all positioned at the angles of a room used primarily by one person who had given considerable thought to where things ought to go. On the mantelpiece, a small carriage clock, a photograph, the same young woman, Miss Marple noted, as the one on Mrs. Stanhope's desk, though here the photograph was larger, and the garden setting was clearly this garden, behind this house, with the copper beech visible at the left edge of the frame. She filed this with the quiet efficiency of long practice, and turned her attention to Dr. Fellows, who had arranged himself in the chair behind the desk with the instinctive preference of someone who felt more secure with a solid object between himself and a conversation. "I've heard the news about Hennessy, naturally," he said. "Dreadful business. His heart, I understand." "We're treating the death as unexplained at present," Craddock said, in the careful tone he had recently learned to use in Miss Marple's presence, which was noticeably more precise than the tone he used in her absence. "Can you tell me when you last saw Mr. Hennessy?" "Last month," Dr. Fellows said, without hesitation. "The partners' quarterly review for the foundation, the 14th of September, at the firm's offices. Not since then?" "Not since then." Miss Marple, who had been examining the arrangement of the desk with the absorbed interest of someone who found office furniture genuinely fascinating, spoke without looking up. "That is rather curious," she said, in the tone of someone thinking aloud, "because Mr. Hennessy's appointment diary, he was kind enough to show it to me when we corresponded, indicated that he had a private meeting scheduled for yesterday afternoon, here in Chipping Croft. He noted only the initials," she paused, "M.F. The silence that followed had a very specific texture. It was the silence of a man recalibrating without any of the recalibration becoming visible, which was itself a considerable achievement and told her rather a great deal. "He may have intended to call," Dr. Fellows said. "I was not at home yesterday afternoon." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "Where were you, if I might ask?" Dr. Fellows looked at her with the first direct attention he had given her since they entered, the look of a man reassessing an object he had initially catalogued incorrectly. "At Elmwood," he said. "My usual Tuesday rounds. I see residents every Tuesday afternoon between 2 and 5. "Every Tuesday," Miss Marple repeated warmly. "How very reliable. Mrs. Stanhope must find that an enormous comfort." She finally looked up from the desk, and her expression was the pleasantly vague one she used as a working tool. "And after 5 o'clock?" "I returned home." "By which route?" A fractional pause. "Farrow Lane. I generally cut through from the home's back gate. It saves the hill." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Farrow Lane, past the offices of Hennessy and Farleigh." "Past them?" "Yes." "At approximately what time would you have passed the offices?" 5:30, perhaps. 20 past. The steadiness was perfect. The hands on the chair arms had not moved. "I didn't notice particularly." Miss Marple smiled at him with the full warmth of a woman who has just received exactly the information she required. "No," she said. "One rarely notices the things one has most reason to notice, does one? It is one of the more reliable aspects of human nature." Craddock asked his questions with the methodical thoroughness he had recently been applying with renewed commitment. Dr. Fellows answered them all with the composed cooperative manner of a man who had nothing to conceal and was entirely willing to be helpful. He confirmed his role as medical consultant to Elmwood. He confirmed his 11-year relationship with the home and with Mrs. Stanhope, described in the careful terms of professional respect. He confirmed that Miss Trent had been, in his clinical assessment, of entirely sound mind at the time of her final will and testament. He did not mention Eleanor Farleigh. He did not mention Geoffrey Farleigh. He did not mention the Trent Foundation accounts. He did not mention the photograph on the mantelpiece. It was this last omission that Miss Marple found most instructive of all, because the photograph was visible from every chair in the room, and any person conducting a conversation in that room, particularly a conversation concerning Elmwood Nursing Home, would, in the ordinary course of social interaction, have offered some acknowledgement of it. A name, a relationship, a casual remark. The photograph of a young woman in a garden was the kind of object that invited comment in the way that flowers, or a fine view, invited comment. One did not simply leave it unaddressed, unless one had very particular reasons for doing so. She looked at it one final time as they rose to leave. The young woman was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with a direct and confident gaze. She stood at the garden gate, the interlocking circles gate, with the ease of someone entirely at home in that garden. She was wearing over a summer dress a light cardigan of a colour that was difficult to determine from a photograph. But her posture was quite clear, and her build, and the particular way she held her shoulders, slightly forward, with a controlled, contained energy that Miss Marple had observed in people who were used to being still and watchful. At the door, Miss Marple turned as was her custom. "The young woman in the photograph," she said with the most natural and conversational air in the world. "Your daughter, perhaps?" The steadiness broke. Not dramatically, nothing as definitive as that. But something shifted behind Dr. Fellows's eyes with the quality of a door that had been very firmly closed suddenly developing a crack along its upper frame. "A former student," he said, "from my teaching hospital days." "How nice," said Miss Marple, "that you've remained in touch." She went down the front path and through the interlocking circles gate, and said nothing further until they had turned onto Market Cross, where she stopped and looked at Inspector Craddock with an expression that was not her working expression, but her real one, sharp and clear and entirely certain. "The young woman in that photograph," she said quietly, "is Diana Felton, Mr. Farleigh's secretary, the woman who left the train at Slough." She let that settle for a moment. "She's not a former student. She has grown up in that garden. The copper beech in the photograph is the same tree that stands at the rear of the property and can be seen from the lane. She has known Dr. Fellows since childhood." Another pause. "I think, Inspector, that she is his daughter, and I think he has gone to very considerable lengths to ensure that no one in Chipping Croft connects her to him." Craddock looked at her. "Why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "if Diana Felton is Dr. Fellows's daughter, then her employment at Hennessy and Farleigh, in a position of direct access to the Trent Foundation files, was not coincidental. It was arranged. And that arrangement tells us a very great deal about how long this plan has been in preparation, and how many people were necessary to execute it." She adjusted her tapestry bag on her arm. "We have Farleigh," she said. "We have Fellows. We have Mrs. Stanhope. We have Diana Felton. 4 people, each occupying a specific position, each with specific access." She looked back toward Farrow Lane. "The question now is which of them administered the poison, and which of them gave the order." Chapter 8. The Trent Foundation Ledger. The public library of Chipping Croft occupied a converted schoolroom on the eastern side of Market Cross, 2 doors down from the tobacconist and directly opposite the War Memorial. It was a small library of the deeply satisfying variety: wooden floors that announced arrivals, shelves that reached the ceiling and required the long-handled retrieval pole kept in the corner, and a librarian of indeterminate age and absolute authority who regarded the Dewey Decimal System with the reverence most people reserved for constitutional law. Miss Marple had visited it that morning, briefly, before her call at Elmwood, and had located 2 items of interest in the local history collection: a directory of Chipping Croft businesses from 1949, and the bound minutes of the Chipping Croft Parish Council from 1955 to 1962. From these she had established 2 things. The first was that a Dr. Arthur Fellows, Malcolm Fellows' father, she presumed, had been listed as a founding subscriber to the Elmwood nursing home when it opened in 1951. The second was that the parish council minutes for October 1958 recorded, in the dry and dutiful language of local governance, the approval of a charitable foundation established for educational purposes by a Miss Arabella Trent, and administered by the solicitor of record, one Mr. Oliver Hennessy. The foundation, in other words, had not been created in response to Miss Trent's death in August. It had existed for 67 years, and for 67 years it had been administered solely by Hennessy and Farleigh. Inspector Craddock obtained the warrant for Hennessy and Farleigh's financial records at 12:30, which Miss Marple considered creditably swift, and by 2 o'clock they were seated in the firm's conference room, a long wood-panelled room smelling of old paper and linseed oil, with 4 archive boxes of foundation documentation arranged on the table, and a young constable stationed at the door. Geoffrey Farleigh had been asked, with the polite firmness that Craddock had been practising since morning, to remain available but not present. He had complied with the smooth cooperation of a man who had decided that smooth cooperation was his most advantageous posture, and had retreated to his own office, where Miss Marple had no doubt he was making telephone calls with considerable urgency. Miss Cartwright, the ink-fingered young secretary, had been asked to assist with the location of specific files. She did so with a silent, concentrated efficiency that suggested her grief had resolved itself in the past few hours into something harder and more purposeful. She placed each requested folder on the table with the precise care of someone who had decided that being useful was the most honest thing available to her, and then withdrew to a chair in the corner where she sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance and said nothing unless asked. Miss Marple found her, of all the people she had encountered in Chipping Croft, the most interesting. Not for what she knew, though she clearly knew a considerable amount, but for the specific quality of her distress, which was not the distress of a secretary who had lost an employer, but of a young woman who had lost someone she had genuinely tried to protect and had not managed to. She filed this observation and turned to the ledgers. The Trent Foundation accounts were kept in 4 leather-bound ledgers of the traditional double-entry variety, each covering approximately 15 years, running from 1958 to the present. Miss Marple was not, she would have been the first to acknowledge, a trained accountant, but she had, over many decades, developed what she considered a respectable working knowledge of household accounts, parish finances, and the specific grammar of figures arranged to conceal rather than illuminate. The first 3 ledgers were, on their surface, unremarkable. Income from Miss Trent's original endowment, carefully invested. Modest disbursements to local educational causes, a school library fund, a grammar school bursary, a small scholarship administered through the local church. The figures balanced. The handwriting was Hennessy's, she had his letters to compare, neat and deliberate and consistent across 30 years. The 4th ledger began in 1998, when Geoffrey Farleigh had become a partner. For the first 6 years of Farleigh's partnership, the accounts continued in the same pattern. The handwriting changed, Farleigh's entries clearly distinguishable from Hennessy's by their forward slanting urgency, but the figures remained consistent, the disbursements recognisable, the balance explicable. Then, in 2004, the entries changed in a way that was not immediately visible, but became, once seen, impossible to unsee. And it was not that figures had been altered precisely. It was that a category of expenditure had been introduced, administrative and consultancy services, that had not existed in the previous 46 years of the Foundation's operation. In 2004 it represented £400 annually. By 2008 it was £1,200. By 2015 it was £8,000. By 2022, the year before Miss Trent's final deterioration, it was £23,000 per annum, representing nearly a third of the Foundation's annual income. The payee, recorded in the neat shorthand of someone who expected no one to look too closely, was listed throughout as ECF Consulting. Miss Marple looked at this for a long quiet moment. ECF Eleanor Caroline Farleigh, née Brentwood, Geoffrey Farleigh's wife, the former nursing administrator at Elmwood, who had, presumably, no consulting practice of any kind, but whose initials appeared on 20 years of Foundation disbursements totalling, by Miss Marple's careful addition on the corner of her notepad, just under £214,000. She set down her pencil and looked at Inspector Craddock. "There," she said simply. Craddock leaned forward and read the figures with the expression of a man watching something he had suspected become something he could prove. "ECF Consulting," he said. "Mrs. Farleigh's initials," said Miss Marple. "A consulting company that I would be surprised to find registered at Company's House, but which has been receiving Foundation funds for 20 years. This is what Mr. Hennessy found. Not recently. I think he had suspected for some time, but Miss Trent's death in August, and the need to administer the bequest of £120,000 required a full accounting that could not be avoided, and a full accounting would have made the pattern undeniable. So Farleigh needed him gone before the accounting was completed. Before it was filed, Miss Marple said. Filed accounts become matters of record. Matters of record can be examined by interested parties, beneficiaries, the Charity Commission, a new solicitor appointed after a partner's retirement. Mr. Hennessy, I believe, had indicated his intention to retire at the end of this year. His retirement would have triggered exactly that process. She looked back at the ledger, at the neat, forward-slanting handwriting. At 20 years of small, incremental theft, each individual entry modest enough to pass unnoticed, the cumulative, total catastrophic. The plan, I think, was of long standing, she said. Diana Felton placed in the firm 6 years ago, providing access to files and forewarning of any investigation. Dr. Fellows maintaining unquestioned authority over Elmwood's medical records, ensuring Miss Trent's capacity was never formally questioned. Mrs. Stanhope controlling the home's administrative correspondence, and Mrs. Farleigh as the silent recipient, the company that existed on paper and collected its quarterly payments and left no visible trace. Craddock was writing rapidly. And when Hennessy finally confronted it, "He came to Chipping Croft yesterday afternoon," Miss Marple said, "to confront someone directly, as I said this morning. I believe now that he came to see Dr. Fellows, not Farleigh, because Fellows was the medical authority, the one whose signatures underpinned the legitimacy of the entire arrangement. If Fellows could be persuaded to cooperate with an investigation, the medical records of Miss Trent's capacity assessments could be re-examined. Hennessy was, I think, offering him a choice, and Fellows chose the other option. Or communicated the conversation to Farleigh immediately," Miss Marple said, who communicated it to Diana Felton, who had by that evening purchased 2 cups of tea at Paddington Station and boarded the 6:15. She closed the ledger with the careful hands of someone returning a significant object to its proper place. "The digitalis," she said quietly, "will have been Fellows' contribution. He had both the knowledge and the access. A man who has administered a nursing home for 11 years has, one imagines, a very thorough understanding of which medications leave the least traceable signature, and in what concentration they might be introduced into a strong, sweet beverage without immediate detection." From the corner of the room, Miss Cartwright made a small sound. Not quite a word, but with the quality of one. Miss Marple looked at her with great gentleness. "Miss Cartwright," she said, "I think you knew something was wrong. I think you have known for some time. The letter from Elmwood on Monday. You opened it, didn't you, before Mr. Farleigh saw it?" The young woman looked at her with red-rimmed eyes and the expression of someone who's been carrying a weight they were not strong enough for and have been waiting with exhausted hope, yearned for someone to help them set it down. "He was a good man," she said. Her voice was steady in the way of voices that have been held steady through great effort. "Mr. Hennessy. He was the only one in this office who was a good man." "I know," said Miss Marple, "and what you tell Inspector Craddock now will be the best thing you can do for him." She pushed the ledger toward Craddock and rose from the table with the air of someone who has located the central thread of a tangle and is preparing with confidence to draw it through. Chapter 9. The Arrest on Market Cross. The afternoon light over Chipping Croft had the particular quality of October in the English provinces, thin and clear and faintly elegiac, as though the day itself understood that something was drawing to a close and was conducting itself with appropriate solemnity. The War Memorial cast a long shadow across the cobbles. The copper beech at the end of Farrow Lane had lost 3 more leaves to a gust of wind that moved through the square at intervals, rearranging the chrysanthemums at the memorial's base with casual indifference to their arrangement. Mrs. Ida Hatch, at the window of the Copper Kettle, was watching the police Wolseley parked outside Hennessy and Farleigh with the alert stillness of a woman who understood that history was being made in her immediate vicinity, and intended to observe every detail of it. Miss Marple, seated once again at the small table by the window with a fresh pot of tea she did not particularly need, understood that Mrs. Hatch's presence at the window was not merely the product of curiosity, but of the deep communal instinct of a small town absorbing a shock to its self-understanding. Chipping Croft had believed itself to know its own. It had believed Geoffrey Farleigh to be a rising professional, Dr. Fellows to be a trusted medical man, Mrs. Stanhope to be the reliable custodian of its most vulnerable residents. The process now underway on Market Cross was not merely a criminal investigation. It was the revision of a collective story, and that revision would take considerably longer than any legal proceeding to complete. Geoffrey Farleigh came out of the offices of Hennessy and Farleigh at 3:17 in the afternoon between 2 constables, with Inspector Craddock behind him, and the particular careful blankness of a man who has decided that his face will give nothing further away. He was still wearing the excellent suit. His tie was still correctly sombre. He walked with the controlled forward momentum of a man who had decided that the only dignified option remaining was to appear entirely unsurprised. He was not handcuffed, which Miss Marple noted with approval. Craddock had that much sense of proportion. At the door of the Wolseley, Farleigh paused. It was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, and in it he looked once across the square, at the War Memorial, at the copper kettle, at the ordinary, unremarkable face of the town he had occupied for 14 years. His expression, for those 4 seconds, was not the expression of a guilty man caught, which tends toward either defiance or collapse. It was something more complicated and, in its way, more illuminating. The expression of a man confronting the specific reality of a future that had been very precisely planned and had nonetheless at the final moment failed. Miss Marple recognised that expression. She had seen its cousin twice before, in very different circumstances. It was the expression of someone who had believed, with complete conviction, that they were cleverer than the situation, that the plan was sufficiently thorough, that the loose ends had been tied. The loose end in this case had been sitting in a window seat in the second carriage of the 6:15 with a tapestry bag and a half-finished bedsock, and had noticed a scarf wrapped from the wrong side. Dr. Fellows was collected from his house on Farrow Lane at 3:32 by 2 officers from the Reading Constabulary who had driven up at Craddock's request. He came to the door in his cardigan and collared shirt, with the carriage clock visible on the mantelpiece behind him, and the fire now lit, the kindling having been put to use in the intervening hours. He looked, at the moment the door opened, like a man who had spent the afternoon sitting very still and thinking very hard, and had arrived, at some point in the preceding hour, at a kind of resignation. He said nothing as he came down the front path. At the gate with the interlocking circles he paused, as Farleigh had paused, and looked back at the house. The copper beech was visible above the rear wall, its October leaves the colour of old pennies in the afternoon light. Whatever he was thinking as he looked at it, he kept entirely to himself. Mrs. Vera Stanhope received the officers at Elmwood with the composed authority of a woman who had maintained her professional standards through every variety of institutional difficulty and intended to maintain them through this one also. She asked, in the tone of someone making a formal record of proceedings, whether she might telephone her solicitor. She was told that she might. She did so with the efficiency of long habit, replaced the receiver with characteristic precision, and accompanied the officers to the waiting car with the upright posture of a ward sister on inspection. At the door of Elmwood she turned and spoke quietly to the junior nurse on duty. Instructions regarding the afternoon medication round, the dietary requirements of a resident in room 7, the need to telephone a family member about a Tuesday appointment. She completed this list without reference to notes and without apparent agitation, and only then got into the car. Miss Marple, who had been informed of this detail by Craddock when he returned to the copper kettle at 4 o'clock, with the look of a man who had accomplished a great deal and was beginning to feel it, thought that Mrs. Stanhope was in some ways the most troubling of the 4. Not because her crimes were greater, they were not, or at least not in the direct sense, but because her competence and her genuine care for her residents existed in the same person as the willingness to falsify medical records for financial gain. People of that kind were difficult to explain, and more difficult to judge, and Miss Marple had long since given up attempting either. Human nature, as she had told many people on many occasions, was not a simple matter. Diana Felton was not in her flat above the newsagent on Station Road. She had left, the newsagent informed Craddock's constable that morning, early, with a small bag. He had heard her on the stairs at approximately 7:15, and had thought nothing of it, as Miss Felton kept irregular hours and it was not his business. My Craddock received this information with the particular expression of someone locating an omission in their morning's work. Miss Marple received it with less surprise. She is the one I'm most concerned about, she said, when Craddock reported the empty flat. Not as a flight risk. I don't think she has gone far, or with any coherent plan, but because she is the one who did the thing that cannot be undone, and she is the one who will have to live with that knowledge in the most immediate and unmediated way. She looked at a teacup. She bought that cup of tea and she carried it onto that train, and whatever she was told about what it contained, she is not a foolish young woman. She knew. You think she'll come back? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that she went to her father this morning, and that she found officers already there, and that she has been walking since then. There is a great deal of countryside around Chipping Croft. Walking in extremis is a very human response to an unbearable situation. She looked at the window, at the thinning October light, I think someone should look for her before the dark comes, not to arrest her immediately, why she will not run, but because young women walking alone in the countryside in October, in a state of considerable distress, require looking after." Craddock looked at her for a moment with the expression he had been developing over the course of the day, a complex expression combining professional respect, personal adjustment, and the residual self-preservation instinct of a man who had nearly dismissed her as an elderly lady on a train. "I'll send someone," he said. Diana Felton was found at 5:20, sitting on a stile at the edge of a field 2 miles east of Chipping Croft, with her green coat pulled around her against the cold, and her face turned toward a view of the valley that was darkening by degrees as the last of the light withdrew. She was not weeping. She was simply sitting, with the stillness of someone who has run out of the energy required to be anywhere in particular. She came back without resistance and said, in the car, only one thing. "He told me it was a sedative, that Mr. Hennessy would sleep through the journey and wake at the station, and that would be enough. Just enough time to replace the ledger pages that were in the briefcase." She stared at the darkened window. "I knew that wasn't true. I knew before I got off at Slough. But I got off at Slough." The constable driving the car said nothing. Miss Marple, who had asked to accompany the search party and was sitting in the back beside Diana Felton, said nothing either. She placed one small gloved hand over the young woman's and left it there for the remainder of the journey. Some situations, she had long since concluded, were not improved by words. They required only the simple physical acknowledgement that another human being was present and had not looked away. At 6:15 precisely, the irony of the hour not lost on Miss Marple, she sat once more in the railway hotel dining room, with a bowl of vegetable soup and the quiet satisfaction of a matter approaching its conclusion. The town outside had settled into its evening routines. Lights appeared in windows. The tobacconist's display, unchanged since 1947, glowed faintly in the dark. She thought of Mr. Oliver Hennessy, who had written to her 3 weeks ago in careful, worried sentences, asking for a second opinion on some figures that troubled him, who had come to Chipping Croft on a Tuesday afternoon to do the right thing in the right way, face to face as his nature required, who had ridden home on the 6:15 in the corner seat with his hat pulled forward and his scarf wrapped from the wrong side, in the terrible stillness of a man who would not be arriving anywhere. She thought that he deserved, at minimum, the plain and honest account of what had happened to him, and why, and who was responsible. Inspector Craddock would provide that account in due course in the proper professional form. Miss Marple had provided it in her own way, rather more quickly. She finished her soup and ordered a pot of tea, and considered whether to begin a new bedsock or to start on the mittens she had been promising the vicar's wife since September. She decided on the mittens. There was, after all, a great deal of cold weather still to come. Chapter 10. Miss Marple takes the morning train. The 8:47 from Chipping Croft to Paddington departed, as its name suggested, at 8:47, and was met at the platform by a morning of the kind that October occasionally produced as a form of apology for its general behaviour, clear and still, with a low sun that turned the station's modest ironwork to something approaching gold, and made the signal box at the far end of the platform look, very briefly, like a thing of genuine beauty. Miss Marple arrived at the station at 8:31, which was her habit. She did not believe in arriving at railway stations at the last moment. Last moments, in her experience, had a way of becoming instructive in ways one would have preferred to avoid. She bought a platform ticket for Mrs. Doble, who had insisted on accompanying her to the station with the proprietorial warmth of a woman who had provided porridge and useful gossip, and felt entitled to see the results of both through to their natural conclusion. They stood together on platform 1 while a porter moved luggage with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had been moving luggage on this platform for 30 years, and expected to move it for 30 more, and the morning light did its brief, generous work on the ironwork and the signal box. "They'll all be remanded, they're saying," Mrs. Doble said, with the air of someone reporting on a natural phenomenon. "Farleigh and the doctor and Mrs. Stanhope. The girl too, though people feel differently about her." A pause of calibrated neutrality. "Do you think she knew? Properly knew?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that she knew enough to carry a cup of tea onto a train, and chose to believe what she had been told about its contents because the alternative was unbearable. That is not innocence, but it is not quite the same thing as the deliberate, long-considered calculation of the others." She looked at the tracks, which ran away from the platform toward the morning horizon, with the straightforward purposefulness of things that knew exactly where they were going. She will be judged accordingly, I imagine, by the courts and by herself. The latter, I suspect, will be considerably the harsher tribunal. Mrs. Doble absorbed this with the respectful gravity it deserved. And the foundation money? All that Miss Trent left? That is a matter for the Charity Commission and the courts to untangle, Miss Marple said. It will take some time. These things always do, but the records are intact thanks to Miss Cartwright, who had the good sense and the courage to keep copies of certain correspondence in a place Mr. Farleigh did not know about. She allowed herself a small, warm note of satisfaction. Young women of that quality are not sufficiently appreciated, in my experience, until after they have saved a situation that everyone else has failed to prevent. Mrs. Doble nodded with the vigorous agreement of a woman who had strong views about the underappreciation of competent young women and would be sharing them with several people before the morning was out. Inspector Craddock arrived at 8:39, which Miss Marple considered creditably punctual for a man who had conducted 4 arrests the previous afternoon and had presumably spent the intervening hours on paperwork of the most substantial variety. He was carrying a manila folder and had the look of a man who had slept briefly and thought a great deal, and who had arrived at some conclusions that he wished to communicate before the 8:47 removed his opportunity to do so. He thanked Mrs. Doble with professional courtesy, and Mrs. Doble, recognising the nature of the exchange required, discovered a sudden need to speak to the porter about a matter of luggage, and removed herself to a tactful distance. The post-mortem came back this morning, Craddock said, opening the folder with the efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation. Digitalis glycoside, concentrated, in the cup residue and consistent with the powder found on the carriage floor. He looked at Miss Marple with an expression that had resolved, overnight, into something honest and direct. You were right about all of it. The scarf told me a great deal, Miss Marple said. A man of Mr. Hennessy's habits does not rewrap his own scarf from the wrong side. Someone arranged him after death, or as close to death as made no difference, to present the appearance of a sleeping passenger. Someone who was familiar enough with him to know that a man in his condition, in a corner seat with his hat down and his scarf up, would not be disturbed until Slough at the earliest, and who left at Slough. Diana Felton, who had boarded at Paddington, delivered the cup, and waited long enough to ensure the digitalis had taken effect before positioning him. The whole thing, Miss Marple said, with the quiet precision of someone describing a piece of workmanship they found technically admirable and morally reprehensible in equal measure, was a matter of minutes and confidence. The confidence of a young woman who had been in that carriage many times on that route, and knew exactly how long the journey to Slough took, and how unlikely anyone was to disturb a sleeping man in a corner seat. Craddock nodded. Fellows supplied the digitalis. We found the dispensary record at Elmwood, falsified, but not quite well enough. Farleigh gave the instruction. Mrs. Stanhope provided the medical cover for the original capacity assessments. He paused. 20 years of it. Laid £200,000. The mathematics of small thefts, Miss Marple said, are always the most alarming, because each individual figure looks like nothing very much, and the total looks like everything. Mr. Hennessy understood that. He was a thorough man. He had been watching the pattern develop for some time, I think, and had hoped he was mistaken. She looked at the folder in Craddock's hands. One always hopes one is mistaken in matters of this kind. It is much more comfortable to be mistaken. But you weren't. No, said Miss Marple simply. I rarely am. I take no particular pleasure in that, Inspector. I want to be clear on that point. There is nothing gratifying about being correct when the cost of one's correctness is a dead man on the 6:15. Craddock was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful sincerity of a man unaccustomed to this register, I should have listened more carefully on the train last night, when you raised the scarf and the cup. You listened when it mattered, Miss Marple said, with the generosity of a woman who understood that people arrived at understanding on their own timetables and that impatience with the process served no one. You moved quickly once the picture was clear, and that is what preserved the evidence. The ledger pages in the briefcase had been substituted. You noticed that before I did. The originals were found in Mr. Farleigh's desk drawer, which was where they needed to be found. This was not entirely true. Miss Marple had in fact noticed the substitution approximately 4 minutes before Craddock, but she saw no particular benefit in establishing this. and the inspector's confidence was a more useful instrument at full capacity than at reduced. The 8:47 announced its imminent arrival with the distant, purposeful sound of an engine that knew its schedule and intended to keep it. A small stir moved along the platform. The porter abandoned his luggage with the practiced ease of a man who had learned to do two things simultaneously without appearing to do either. Mrs. Doble returned from her conversation at the appropriate moment with the instinctive social timing of a woman who had been reading rooms for 60 years. Miss Marple collected her tapestry bag and the pot of Fortnum's lemon curd, which had survived the preceding 24 hours intact and unregarded, and turned to Inspector Craddock. "There is one thing I would ask," she said. "Miss Cartwright, the secretary. She acted with considerable courage in preserving those records, and with considerable integrity in speaking to you. She's young, and she's worked in that office for 3 years, and it will not be easy to find another position in a town where Hennessy and Farleigh is the primary subject of conversation for the foreseeable future." She looked at him, with the directness she reserved for requests she considered important. "If there is any commendation that can be made on her behalf, to a potential employer or otherwise, I hope you will make it." Craddock noted this with the expression of a man adding it to a list. "I will. Thank you." She looked once more at the tracks, and at the morning light on the ironwork, and at the hills above Chippingcroft that were doing something very fine in the October clarity. "It is a small town," she said. "Not unkindly. It will recover. Small towns are more resilient than people suppose. They have survived a great many revelations about their own inhabitants, and they will survive this one. The chrysanthemums will be replaced at the memorial in due course. The tea room will continue. Someone else will polish the brass plate at Hennessy and Farleigh, or take it down, and either way the door will open again for business within the year." She said this not with cynicism, but with the particular form of comfort that comes from long observation of the world's durability, its tendency to continue quietly and without drama, past the worst of what its inhabitants inflict upon it and one another. "Human nature," she added, settling her tapestry bag more firmly on her arm, as the 8:47 drew alongside the platform with a long and conclusive exhalation of steam, "does not take holidays, but neither, I have found, does human decency. They operate simultaneously, and in the end, not always quickly, and not always without considerable loss, the decency tends to outlast the other." She said goodbye to Mrs. Doble, who pressed her hand with the warmth of a woman making a new and genuine friend, and to Inspector Craddock, who shook it with the respect of a man who had arrived, by a somewhat indirect route, at a well-earned humility. She found a window seat in the second carriage. She took out the mittens, the blue wool she had purchased from the Chippingcroft haberdashery that morning, since the bedsock was now complete, and settled them onto her needles with the small establishing movements of a woman arranging herself for a journey. The 8:47 moved out of Chippingcroft station at 8:47 precisely. Miss Marple watched the platform slide away, and the town and the hills above it catching the morning light, and the copper beach at the far end of Farrow Lane that was just visible for a moment above the rooftops before the train curved south, and it was gone. She thought of Mr. Hennessy, making his careful notes in his careful hand, worrying his careful worries, doing his honest best in a situation that had been arranged over 20 years, with the specific intention of defeating honest bests. She thought of Miss Cartwright with her ink-stained finger, and her hidden copies. She thought of Diana Felton on a stile at the edge of a darkening field, having run out of the energy required to be anywhere in particular. She thought that the world contained a very great deal of sorrow that was not inevitable, and that this was both the most discouraging and the most important thing about it, because sorrow that was not inevitable was sorrow that might, with sufficient attention and sufficient willingness to notice the small discordant notes, be prevented. Not always, not even often enough, but sometimes. She knitted 2 rows of the blue mitten. The 8:47 ran south through the October morning, through fields and villages and the quiet, unremarkable English landscape that looked, from a train window, like a place where very little of consequence ever happened. Miss Marple, who knew better, kept her eyes on the view and her needles moving, and was content. And there, dear friends, we reached the end of our journey on the 6:15, and what a journey it has been. From that very first quiet carriage, with its October dark pressing against the windows and a still figure in a corner seat, to the chrysanthemums of Market Cross and the morning train home, Miss Marple has reminded us once again that the most extraordinary things are always hidden inside the most ordinary ones. I do hope this mystery kept you warm company this evening. wherever you are in this great wide world. Before you go, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever noticed a small discordant detail in everyday life that turned out to mean something? A wrong note, a misplaced kindness, something that simply didn't quite fit? Miss Marple would say that's your instincts doing their finest work, and I think she'd be right. If you'd like to join our cozy community and never miss a new story, do remember to subscribe. We have new mysteries waiting for you every single day, and every single comment you leave is read with genuine gratitude and warmth. Until next time, dear friends, settle in, wrap up, and keep noticing the small things. They matter more than anyone supposes,